All right, welcome back. I apologize. I lost my microphone for a while. It was left at an Airbnb when I was visiting some church services, and I had to drive a good ways to get it back because it is a pretty good microphone. It's probably one of the better ones you could buy, the Yeti. So I'm going to lose my Yeti. But I was also feverishly trying to finish this book, which it took me a good while to finish because of all the other stuff that was going on with the holidays. But I did finish Wahlberg's book, and we got some more criticisms here and analysis. The next section, of course, he deals with the relationship between U.S. and Israel, which again he terms the postmodern imperialism. He begins by talking about the 1991 and Bush Jr. Bush Sr. and then the co-opting of the UN, and that these postmodern states, as he calls them, are essentially what he takes to be the post-Soviet bloc era states transitioning over to the market economy and to what he calls neocolonialism, which is the market is God. And so it's no longer the overt imperialism of the past, but the covert postmodern imperialism of the neoliberal New World Order market economy. He talks about Fukuyama and Fukuyama calling it the end of history, talking about the clash of civilizations. And he argues that at one point Bush went against the Israel lobby and that this is what caused Bush his loss in 1992. Then we get to the period of Clinton, and Clinton, of course, is supposedly more favorable to the Israel lobby, I suppose in certain ways, but there's other stories that the whole Monica Lewinsky thing was because Clinton angered the Israel lobby. Not sure exactly what was going on with all that, but regardless, whether it was neocons or whether it was Clinton's, even then, he notes the foreign policy continued the same. So with Cheney and the neocons, you get the targeting of the former Soviet bloc. This is the central area. Cheney writes a paper arguing for this. He says defense strategies for the 90s. NATO is key here, and this leads to the war on terror. So 9/11 then factors into this, of course, prominently as one of the justifications for the policies in the Middle East and other regions as well, because again, the war on terror is global. So we have the entrance here of the PNAC documents he discusses at length, and PNAC, of course, is connected not just to 9/11 foreign policy, but full spectrum dominance, really, and I think that's true. So ultimately, we can see this not just as a short-term Middle Eastern strategy, but PNAC is part of long-term technocratic planning. So that's why it includes things like Star Wars Defense Initiative, expansion into those realms, space-based weapons, bioweapons, race-specific bioweapons, all of which are discussed in PNAC. So it's much bigger than just 9/11 or the drug trade or oil. Those are all factors, but as we saw earlier, control of energy is a big part of it. Now, the Mackinder Doctrine is still kind of the working basis here. And then we have the idea of setting up a clash of civilizations from the neoconservatives like Bernard Lewis and Samuel P. Huntington. And this capitalizes on older Christian ideas of crusades against Islam and Bush's whatever his 9/11 phrases were about a new crusade or whatever. A new crusade, clash of civilizations and mustard gases. So we have the period here of the late 80s and 90s of deregulation and the dissing of welfare on the part of Maggie Thatcher and Ronnie Reagan and the idea of the free markets. And the irony here, of course, is that the removal of the welfare for the average citizens did not include the removal of welfare for corporations in the military-industrial complex. So the corporate state, corporate welfare continued unabated, surprise, surprise, but the public was, of course, demonized for welfare. and the doctrine of the corporation as an individual and the rights of an individual now comes into play in the post-deregulation free market era. So then we have the rise of the neocons after the Reagan period. And this is American Enterprise Institute, Center for Security Policy, PNAC, AEI, APAC. Neocons come to the throne in full force. The idea is to use the duped Bible Belt moral majority people, use the Saudis, use radical Islam, use the values, promote the values of, quote, individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, rule of law and democracy and free markets, and, quote, human rights is now the justification for doing whatever we want. Well, or the neocons doing whatever they want. And of course, he rehashes the earlier arguments of the imperial rules, free trade, wars and direct occupation of soft and hard power, excuses like weapons of mass destruction, false flags, and the empire itself is accepted, right? Imperial exceptionalism, liberal imperial exceptionalism. Then he goes back to 1999 and he talks about the period of the bailouts and how the housing crisis factored into this. The removal of Glass-Steagall, we know about that, which separated private banking from the casino capitalism of trading and derivatives markets and so forth. He discusses the bailouts, how the Fed can never be audited. Yes, we all know. So that we get a lot of the piecemeal imagery that we got from Ron Paul is laid out in fuller perspective here. And he talks about how the IMF, we know this from the banker who came in from the cold, the Greg Palast articles about Joseph Stiglitz. We know this from John Perkins's Confessions of an Economic Hitman, how they would go in and basically sign the nations onto giant loads of debt. And this is a way to control the nations. It was big hedge funds that were in the back of this. U.S. banks then create a euro meltdown as a way to bankrupt these countries. And then there is a fire sale. So then you go in and privatize everything, buy it off, and you have basically allocated the nation's assets. So whether it's Greece or Portugal or Ireland or Spain or whoever, this is the model. Massive debt scams, basically. Now, the EU is a battleground of many battlegrounds for this New World Order. Not that the EU is good, but that turning the EU to the strategies of the neocons, basically. Iran matters in all of this, not because so much ideology as it is oil. Surprise, surprise. So we have, again, the repeat of the Bank for National Settlements model, which is basically utilizing the IMF, regulated by the BIS teams. And then this basically puts a monetary virus into all the countries. The countries go broke. Problem, reaction, solution. Boom, bust, cycle, scam. Listen to my interview with Tim Kelly on that. And you buy up the country. He talks about the Reagan doctrine and how Krautheimer, the Fox guy, was the father of the Reagan doctrine, supporting the Mujahideen. We know about all that. We've talked about that for many years. America really comes into being the world police after the 90s. Now, they already kind of had been, but more so out in front after the 90s. Then he talks about left globalism versus the neocons. They all have the same end goal, whether it's Brzezinski and Obama and the Clintons or the neoconservatives on the other side. The goals are the same. And thus it's a fake duopoly because the foreign policy never changes, aside from maybe certain minor issues. Now, here he critiques a little bit of the United Nations. However, there's no mention of the degenerate UNESCO plans. And in this entire discussion of postmodern imperialism, another flaw here is no discussion of eugenics, dysgenics, depopulation. There's the title of racism is thrown around a little bit here in Wahlberg's book, but nothing about abortion and population. In fact, in a couple places, he seems to give credence to the climate scam. So that may be, again, because of his associations with UN work. So that's another area of criticism, is that we have a pretty hardcore analysis of the facts of global geopolitical outworkings. And there's are moralistic attempts to critique this and that position, but no basis or philosophy upon which to give a moral critique. So he's laying out the facts, but what's the basis for the critique? And if you're going to make moral critique, well, on what basis is any of this wrong? And what about things like, depopulation? The UN is all about that. UN human rights scams are the bases of wars at times. The UN does not function in the way that supposedly it was supposed to. I disagree. I think it functions exactly like it was supposed to. The UN says nation states are over. And then he gets into some of the classics of the 90s, the Clinton era, CIA operations and usages of the Kosovo liberation, the bombings in the Balkans, use the radical Islam there, use ethnic squabbles to control, divide and conquer, do the same thing basically in any of the hotbed regions. And then in comes the IMF to, quote, solve things, and everybody's on board with the New World Order. Then he begins to talk about Iraq and Iran, the CIA training of Saddam, and then the using up of Saddam after he had expired like milk. And he talks about other puppet people that have been used and expired. The usage of the same lies, which is funny, over and over and over. Weapons of mass destruction. These people are a threat, even though we armed Saddam. The CIA gave Saddam, as I wrote about in my new book, the chemical weapons to use, and he used them when he was told to. That's the basis for Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, right? Weapons of mass destruction. Saddam's got WMDs. If he had any, they were given by the U.S. So Iran, the issue with Iran is about oil and the dollar, preeminence of the dollar, according to Wahlberg. That's probably true. The divide and conquer plan of dividing up regions, provoking and stoking the ethnic divides, that's kind of a no-brainer. That's the ancient strategy back to Caesar. Wars of the Gallican Wars. And there's an interesting, insightful section on the control of global energy. This came to the fore in the Bush II era of controlled chaos. Start the war and then solve it with an invasion. This is the model going back to Korea and Vietnam. This is the model of stoking the civil wars, controlled chaos. This is why we need the world police military force. Then we have an insightful analysis, which not many people touch on, which I'm glad he did, which is the creation of dividing the world into its regions. I touched on this in my analysis of Richard Kelly's movie The Box, because it shows up there. But you have world operations of CENTCOM, which was set up in 1983, Central Command. And then in 2002, you had NORTHCOM set up for Mexico and the Arctic. CENTCOM, by the way, is Middle East, Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Israel, Turkey, Persia, Diego Garcia military base. NORTHCOM is Mexico and the Arctic. SOUTHCOM, Central America, Argentina. PACOM is Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, AFRICOM 2007, EUCOM 1947. So in different decades, basically, you've had the same expansion of dividing the globe into these control comms for military and cyber purposes, eventually, with Cybercom. And then he talks about the many bases. So publicly, apparently, there's 737 bases that are known. But guess what? There's hidden bases. Yes, exactly. So there's probably at least 1,000, he speculates. And that's probably true. So guess what? New World Order is already here. You thought the New World Order was coming. It's already here. It's been here for a long time. And then we go back. He kind of recaps, goes back and discusses the Star Wars Defense Initiative. Of course, I've covered this many times. I think of Trump's discussions of the Space Force. Huge. Space Force. Huge. Supposedly, the purpose of SDI and Space Force would be to have a first strike capabilities. And then he talks about these crazy tales of viruses and hacking and all this kind of stuff. Sounds a little James Bond here in this section. And he talks about Stuxnet virus, which, we knew that was a virus implanted on Iranian computers, supposedly by design. The CIA supported at one time Jundala, which is interesting, the Iranian terror network. And in different regions, the CIA has supported the terrorist forces to destabilize. Well, we know that. That's no surprise, right? Whether it's the Chechens or the Kurds or bin Laden or the MEK or the Kosovo Liberation Organization, those are the radicals that are supported. Now, soft power includes U.S. aid, which is billions and billions of dollars. We know this. And the biggest recipients of U.S. aid are Iraq, Israel, Egypt, Afghanistan, Colombia, Jordan, and Pakistan. And it's kind of been that for a long time. And you wonder, well, why is Colombia on that list? Well, my guess is it probably has to do with drugs. So the U.S. promotes the radical Islamic works in schools, in a lot of these schools, back to the 80s, up into the 90s. And so wonder why there's the rise of radical Islam. Well, maybe because the U.S. spent millions of dollars to expand radical Islamic education. No surprise there. Then he talks about all the foundations. The color revolutions, goes back and discusses Otpor, which we know about Otpor was used in Serbia. And this was against Milosevic. And then he talks about Georgia, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, which resulted in the regime change there. This is if you remember back in 2011, there was the 2010, 2011, the Georgia crisis. It was all over the news. Ukrainian Orange Revolution, we know about this, 2014. There was also a Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, which I was not familiar with that one. Then we get the Arab Springs and discussions of how to, quote, promote democracy. Gene Sharp promoting democracy. And Google, they're involved in this. We know about that. Old news. But there was an interesting discussion here of the State Department partnered with Facebook, MTV, Google, YouTube, AT&T, JetBlue, GenNext, Columbia Law School in order to launch a global network of empowerment for the young. So your revolutions are fake. Next, he moves on to discuss the drug trade. Now, we've talked about this in many books, many analyses. The drug trade is crucial to not just the global economy, but controlling the New World Order. And drugs are, of course, a powerful weapon. So go back to the Opium Wars. You use opium as a means of addicting the population. Look at Middle America today with meth and pills done by design, not just to make you poor, but also to enslave you. Because as many vices as you have, that's how many masters you have. And this opium explosion, which he kind of rehearses the stuff we all know about ever since U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, opium production has exploded 30-fold. We know this. Now, there was an interesting section here, which again vindicates a lot of the arguments I've made, which is that the book's thesis is that postmodern imperialism is the voluntary multilateral global economy with the IMF, World Bank, and World Trade Organization setting up basically a cooperative empire. The age-old laws of international relations are have been repealed. Quigley says that exact same thing. Europeans have stepped out of a Hobbesian world of anarchy and social contract, and now into the Kantian world of perpetual peace based on market. And that's because of Kant's essay about perpetual peace through global government. How are we going to get that? Through free trade and through the market. The market will save us. Again, vindicating essentially everything that I've said about the Enlightenment and laissez-faire, free markets, and so forth. Next, we have a discussion of the history of the relationship of Israel to the U.S. And he goes back to discussing the relationship of Israel to older empires. So here he talks about Israel in relationship to the Spanish Empire, which was a complex relationship of intertwined connection that from the 13th to the 15th century eventually led to falling out. And so the Jews eventually, he says, turned on Spain. And then he discusses the relationship of Benjamin Disraeli to England and the history of Disraeli, which a lot of this is also echoes what's in Quigley. The seizure of the Suez Canal was, of course, a Rothschild operation on behalf of British Empire. And then he talks about leftist organizations, right organizations. He talks about originally the the Jews that were religious, the Orthodox and the Haredi. He says there was opposition to the idea of the creation of the State of Israel. However, Halford Mackinder said that Israel would be a strategic ally in the region and it could function as a Atlanticist globalist outpost. And so the ideas of Herzl were supported by the Rothschilds, and that this would be advantageous to Western civilization in the face of Eurasian non-democratic states. So the argument goes. Then he talks about the interesting relationship between Stalin and the Jews. And interestingly, Menachem Begin was an NKVD agent. I did not know that. That is interesting. But this chapter section basically vindicates the analysis that Mark Hackard had in his translation of the essay from the KGB colonel about Victor Rothschild being a Soviet. So Stalin apparently originally saw the possibility of Israel as an ally to socialism. And then it was seen to be the opposite because the West was able to ally with Zionism better than Stalin was. So Stalin then turned on Zionism. Let's see. The next section, he talks about the usage of Christian Zionism, especially in America, its power, and its association with the Bible Belt. Again, we've covered that, and I've covered that in essays, a lot of theological analyses and critiques. And I said earlier in my critique of this book, my analysis, that he doesn't factor in Christendom's rejection of usury. However, here he does. So later on in the book, he does mention that for the first millennium, Christianity rejected usury. he does discuss secular Judaism as capitalism. But when he talks about Marx here, he quotes Karl Marx about secular Judaism being capitalism. Isn't Marx a secular Jew? So wouldn't Marxism also fit into that category? And yes, and that's because I would argue there's some lack of insight on dialectics on the part of this author. That both capitalism and Marxism are part of a secular dialectic. Now he talks about the ability to make money through alchemy. Now he doesn't say alchemy, but basically the alchemy of finance through fiat currency. Once you divorce the printing of the money from anything backing it, then you can buy up anything with the power to print the money. And he quotes, of course, Lord Rothschild on that. I don't care who makes the laws if I can print the money. Right, the famous Rothschild quote. I care not who makes the laws, only give me control of, the printing press or whatever for money. We know that the Federal Reserve was, of course, set up on the model, this private banking model, Bank of England model. He argues that the Rothschilds financed Garibaldi in the campaign to unify Italy. And if I recall, Garibaldi was a Freemason. I think that's right. So that would make sense. The Balfour Declaration, of course, which brought about the founding of the State of Israel. And then he talks about the battle of the Russian oligarchs with Putin. 7 of these 9 oligarchs, he says, were Jewish. And this is part of why there is a battle of the West, the neocons, with Russia. He gets into the looting of Russia, which we all know about from the 90s. There were Senate hearings about this, and he discusses Putin sort of going against, what's that one guy's name? Khodorkovsky or whatever his name is, the guy who, a couple of these characters who have passed away on their yachts. There's one guy whose name escapes me. He was a mathematician billionaire who passed away. I don't think it's Khodorkovsky, it's the other guy. What's his name? Anyway, one of the famous oligarch billionaires who has passed away. Now, then he discusses the usage of terror, and he talks about how the empire has to use terror, but he doesn't mention red terror, by the way, which I'm pretty sure that the Reds use terror because Wahlberg, of course, has an affinity for the Reds, but the Reds use terror. So all power blocks apparently tend to use terror in the modern world as a powerful means of ensuring compliance, I suppose. And he talks about Viktor Ostrovsky, right? Famous book, By Way of Deception, and some of the tactics and techniques of Mossad. He talks about the training of Blackwater, Kellogg Brown Root contractors, as well as Israeli assassins being notorious for their skills. Then we have mafia and drugs, again, playing into the terror networks. And, yeah, we know about that. That's, if you read Daniel Estlund's book, Shadow Masters, he discusses that at length with the figure of Victor Bout, which is the basis, if I recall, of Lord of War, with Nick Cage. Lord of War. I'm the Lord of War, so I think, but I'm actually a stooge of the CIA and the generals who don't even know it. Now, here, too, he talks about the different Muslim Brotherhood did not support resistance to Israeli occupation. It supported it, and it fought the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, long-time connections with British intelligence. And then he talks about Israel starting Hamas, and the reason for this was, and this was in Haaretz too, by the way, the argument was that to make sure that there would not be peace with Palestinians, there needed to be an anti-peace excuse through the existence of something like Hamas. He then talks about gatekeepers in the media. There's a debate later, and he mentions Chomsky. Well, I think Chomsky's a gatekeeper, but he doesn't really say that. And he talks about liberalism and neoconservatism in America and its role in terms of Israel lobby. He also mentions the controversial role of South Africa, which is curious because on the one hand, we are told that South Africa is a racist state and that Israel is guilty of supporting a racist state. And then we're told that there are no murders of white people in South Africa. So I don't think there's any simple answer either way to this question. Just a mess, basically. Let's see. He mentions B'nai B'rith, which is well known as a Masonic secret society for Jews, basically. The role of Hollywood in promoting wars. The role of Hollywood and connection to Edward Bernays. I've covered that many times. No secrets here. And then he mentions networks like Chabad, and are they just religious or do they also engage in espionage? He mentions that neoconservatives often have meetings and alliances with Chabad. And then the diamond trade, right? The fascinating secrets of the underground world of the diamond trade, which the argument, I think, is that diamonds are actually semi-precious. They're not that hard to obtain. However, this is a controlled market, which makes diamonds more valuable because a few families, like the De Beers and there's one of the other families, I forget the name, that controls the diamond trade. And this goes back to basically to Cecil Rhodes and Rothschild and the British Empire setting up the diamond mines. But diamonds factor into drug and mafia globally. Now, there's an interesting debate at the end of this chapter. And he cites a whole bunch of figures from Brzezinski to Chomsky to who's the other guy? Somebody named Freeman, who was in Obama's administration. I don't know who Freeman is, but this is some guy Obama appointed. And the reason there is this appendix here is does America have power over Israel, or does Israel control America? So he discusses all the different characters in this debate, and the argument is that if Israel did have control of America, they would not have gotten, there would not have been the Iran nuclear deal that John Kerry and Obama and Brzezinski, I guess, worked out. And then the other argument is, who was it? One of the Israeli guys. Which guy? One of these big Israeli people, I forget. It says something like, we control the U.S. Congress or something. I forget which guy said that. One of those guys. So you've got kind of left globalists who aren't that favorable to Israel. And then you've got neocons, basically, in this controlled dialectic. And so he mentions Brzezinski and the support of the Mearsheimer book that was controversial. And that's why the right-wing Israelis don't like Brzezinski. Now, I've told you that for a long time, but here he talks about it as well. Well, I guess he knew about it before I did because this book came out a long time ago. But so anyway, so that's the debate over Brzezinski and these characters. Then he goes to Brzezinski in the final chapter to discuss the five pivots of our period and the five players. The five pivots are Ukraine, Azerbaijan, South Korea, Turkey, and Iran. So these are the big areas of the new geopolitical game. And then who are the five players? Let's see here, the five players. Let's see. Well, oh wait, here it is. The key players are Russia, China, Pakistan, India, Turkey, and Iran. And then he talks about Saudi Arabia and Israel as places that have their own agendas. And then he discusses and debates China. And how independent and how much of a player China is. And he says Brzezinski does not view China as a threat to the U.S. Well, yeah, because they're part of globalism in terms of their party. He also discusses the complex relationship between Russia and Israel. So we can't boil these things down to simple good guy, bad guy things, which is what a lot of people who criticize me say. So you can see that even Wahlberg in his analysis from his sort of left, progressive, UN globalist, quasi-Marxist perspective understands that as well. So there we have essentially postmodern imperialism. I'm not sure what rating I would give the book. It's certainly accurate in its analysis of the 20th century. The weaknesses, I think, that we saw in my critique of the first part still hold true. There's some good insights into global markets in terms of scams, how the scams work, how money laundering works, how drug trade works, how propaganda works. However, a lot of stuff left out, right? What about climate change as a scam? What about depopulation as a scam? What about global atheism as a scam? What about Western funding for Marxist movements? No mention of any of that. So some weaknesses here. No clear presentation of solutions or strategies, which of course I would, refer to Christianity, to Scripture, to the tradition of the church. But of course, Wahlberg comes at this again, I would say, from an atheist perspective, as best I can tell. Maybe some sort of Islamic perspective. I'm not exactly sure what his view is, but definitely some admissions on the part of the fact that, yes, Christianity was, for the first millennium, anti-usury. And then we don't get anything positive really said about Christianity after that. So definitely some weaknesses. Yeah. But could we say it's a globalist book? Yes and no. I mean, what is the status of the UN here? I mean, I see the UN as a globalist institution that pretends to play, good cop, bad cop with America and neoconservatism. Is it going to be salvaged? I don't think so. Wahlberg would not be, I don't think. Well, we also don't have much of a discussion of traditional morals here, right? I guess he does or doesn't see those things. I mean, what about degeneracy? What about the promotion of degeneracy and toxic culture? I mean, there's discussions of culture for propaganda, but what about toxic culture? Don't see any of that. So, kind of a cold, calculated analysis, but not much. The cold, hard facts, I guess you could say, but not a lot of hope or projects for solutions. I don't think we're going to get solutions out of the UN or whatever sort of flavor of globalism he prefers. So that's my analysis. Thank you for listening. And next week, maybe we'll do Soldiers of Reason if I can read a good bit of it. I'll be heading back home finally now that the holidays are over. Thank you for your patience. We've got some interesting theological texts we could do, philosophical texts. Not sure where we'll go from this, but hope you enjoyed your dose of geopolitical analysis this week. And God bless you guys. Merry Christmas, and I'll talk to you soon.